Well, ladies and gentlemen, now it is time to move on to our keynote on professionalism and progression, esports, and its rise to maturity. Well, for this, we're joined by Stephan Hanna, Director of Global Strategy and Partnerships, ESIC. Well, as ESIC's Director of Global Strategy and Partnerships, Stephan is responsible for developing its strategic outlook. Stephan is an experienced forensic accountant with accompanying legal qualifications. He's somebody who's got an extensive experience in the area of forensic expert work, government and legislative consultancy, and law enforcement coordination. Stephan plays a pivotal role with the organization in his pioneering of various technology developments and forensic practices with ESIC's Global Integrity Framework. Well, with this, I'd like to humbly welcome on the stage and screen Stephan Hanna to join us. Thank you so much, Stephan, for taking out your valuable time and being a part of our show today.
Thanks very much, Hanna. Appreciate that. And thank you very much for having me on. I'm really excited to get into today's topic. So without further delay, I'll go ahead and share the presentation screen and hopefully we get underway.
Right, let's do that. Thank you, and over to you, Stephan.
Awesome. Okay, great. So again, it's really great to be here. And thanks to the gracious hosts over at TressCon for the invitation. Today, we're going to be discussing, as Bhavana said, the professionalism and progression, esports and its rise to maturity. I've added a little bit at the end there through the lens of integrity. The ESIC stands for the Esports Integrity Commission. And what I'm hoping today is to go through another side of esports that's not very frequently talked about. We generally, when we hear about esports, we generally hear big numbers, lights, camera, action, and all of the good things. And I think there's definitely a place for that. But I think it's very important as an industry to be balanced and to understand that there is risk. And hopefully today, what I'm going to look at is more of a view into the industry's risks and into the risk framework that is currently in place in the industry, and hopefully exploring that a little bit in the lens of maturity and esports' path to what we would call and refer to as maturity. So first of all, I think in understanding risk, it's important to establish background. Background behind what challenges esports has faced historically that continue to perhaps plague it. These are wicked problems, things that esports has struggled with. And this will lay the format or the groundwork for our exploration of esports' progression into professionalization. So this is a really great diagram by Catalyst. It does a good job at illustrating the complexity of the esports ecosystem. Now, not necessarily too far from traditional sporting, however, slightly more complex than traditional sporting. Esports has a very fragmented and spread ecosystem. You'll notice that there are several different stakeholders in the ecosystem, each with unique rights, obligations, functions, revenue streams, and so on. Perhaps the most important, or arguably the most important stakeholder would be the publishers. Unlike traditional sports, where no one organization owns the rights to soccer, owns the rights to tennis, owns the rights to cricket, publishers, by contrast, own the rights to the esport. Publishers like Riot own rights to the esport titles like League of Legends and Valorant more recently. Valve own the rights to Dota 2, CSGO, and so on. The reality is that without the express authority and permission of these rights holders, the esports wouldn't even exist. So from the get-go, we see that there's a significant power imbalance. And arguably rightly so, the publishers have created the intellectual property and they should be able to exercise rights over the intellectual property in any way that they want. But you can obviously appreciate that the risk created from a commercialization perspective When you create an entire industry off the back of a permission, then that industry is susceptible to that permission. Not just that, putting the permission aside, we see that there's an incredible fragmentation of competitions, tournament organizers, teams, players, all over the world, different jurisdictions, different interactions, different levels of play, all without any real cohesion, other than being able to put them into some bubbles like we see in this diagram. There's no real way to understand esports as a holistic concept. And that's generally driven by the fact that esports is an umbrella term. Unlike sports, where you have soccer in its own, or football in its own distinct category, esports is a term that defines multiple different titles, multiple different fan bases, multiple different communities, multiple different tournament operators, and so on. So to look at esports as a whole and attempt to standardize it is an incredibly complex task. Further complexity arises when we consider the nature of esports and the underpinnings of esports. Esports is an industry built on passion, and what I'm going to take you through just in the next couple of slides is a case study on that, being the Dota International. Now, Dota 2, I mentioned it earlier, is a intellectual property piece. It's a game that's owned by Valve, the publisher. Now, Valve has a range of different tournaments that they run. One of them is called the Dota 2 International. It's a very big esports tournament with a crazy amount of prizing. But the mechanism that they use to raise the prize pool is quite interesting. And essentially what the prize pool is it's funded, in part at least, by the purchases of the fans. So the fans, as they gear up, getting ready for the international, they purchase these virtual items or skins or skin packs, and a percentage of revenue generated from those items goes into the prize pool of the event. And I have a hypothetical question here at the end that says, how much do you think was raised in the 2019 event? Consider that for a moment. And the reason why I ask that question is because this is an illustration of the passion that drives this industry. And arguably, I mean, my perspective, at least at a personal capacity, is that this passion and this sort of willingness to strive to establish esports as an industry is an absolute credit to the proponents of the industry and the passion that they have. And now let's look at the answer to that question. $34 million was contributed, and it was a 2,045% increase from the prior year. And this contribution was entirely from purchases of virtual items. This slightly less legible chart breaks up and shows us year on year, starting from 2014 onwards, the amount of purchase activity relating to purchases that ended up transpiring to prize pool contributions. And you can see year on year, each of the lines and each of the trends grows. And then you end up with a 2019 one all the way at the top, which so far surpasses any other year that was previous. So this conclusively at least illustrates anecdotally that esports is an industry built on passion. And I'm going to elaborate on why that's important afterwards. If we also look at our audience, we see, and this is a Nielsen extract, so credit to them. We see that the esports industry has a relatively young audience. We see that 62% of fans identify themselves as being in the age of 18 to 34. And what this means is that there is a consideration to be had regarding that age group when we look at risk. And that consideration is quite simple. We've observed that there is an industry fragmentation issue. We've observed that there's a passionate market, and we've observed there's a young participant demographic. So if we translate those risks, we see that the young participant demographic translates to a youth risk. The industry fragmentation and the passionate market translate to commercial viability and competitive integrity risks. Now, of course, this is all very summary so far, but when we look at risk, we need to assess the risk as it exists, but also what that risk implies when we look at esports and its path to maturity. Now, in my introduction, I discussed esports and the general sentiment around esports. It's a booming industry. It's a lights camera action, amazing, finance and venture funding rounds, hundreds of millions of dollars going into this thing. But is that really the nature and the true reality of esports behind the scenes? Well, let's look at gambling. ESIC is quite focused on match fixing and betting fraud because we believe that industry risk resulting from these two things is growing rapidly. This chart from Naris Advisors gives us an idea of what that looks like from a materiality perspective. We see in the chart a visible and invisible market. Each of these markets are unique in that they contribute risk to the esports industry. We mentioned earlier that there was a threat to youth, commercial viability, and competitive integrity. Well, from our observations at ESIC and our work, we've seen that betting fraud and match fixing contribute risk primarily to all three of those areas. The young participants are easily corrupted. The competitive integrity of the industry is at risk because of this activity. And the commercial viability of the industry falls into question when you can't establish competitive integrity, especially considering that esports as a fundamental concept is focused and centered around the existence of competitive integrity. Without competitive integrity, it's not really a competition. It's not really investable as an entertainment product. It's important to note that based on our study of data, it looks like Valve titles currently account for about 70% of suspicious bet, and Blizzard titles account for about 22% of suspicious bets. The reality is that we have the data to tell us where the risk lies, and in doing so, we can actually assess and anticipate risk on an ongoing basis. But this does cause us some concern, especially in the current global environment of the COVID-19 pandemic. Ever since the existence of the COVID-19 pandemic, betting revenues have skyrocketed as esports became the only sport that was really available for betting propositions. We at ESIC have seen an increase of about 340% in suspicious betting activity when comparing our COVID-prone years to our pre-COVID years. And very importantly, and perhaps most worryingly, we've seen a reluctance or a refusal by publishers to monetarily contribute to combating match fixing in esports. It's often said that esports is allergic to match fixing, allergic to betting and the concept of betting. But the unfortunate reality is that betting poses such a large risk and an increasingly large risk that it cannot simply just be ignored. The key takeaway from all of this so far is that concept of vulnerability strangling viability. The fact of the matter is that the participant demographic in esports is perfect for gambling corruption. They're youth, relatively young, passionate, they have disposable income, and they're sensitive to the digital medium. They're experiencing esports, frankly, through the digital medium. We've seen also that there's a very high interest base in esports in the key areas of concern, which include the Southeast Asian region, Chinese region, and also the United States of America. These are also the key illegal gambling epicenters. At the moment, it seems that there is no governing body that enforces regulations and there are no real standards. And really that last point on my slide in bold is quite important. Games can definitely survive match fixing, and that's probably why publishers don't really turn attention to it. But esports as an industry cannot. That entire industry built on permissions and built on the concept of esports cannot survive match fixing. So the reality is that in the presence of a high youth competitive integrity and industry risk, a lack of regulation and oversight damages commercial viability of esports as a long-term proposition. And you'll see our asterisked regulation and oversight is a very important thing, because proportionate regulation and oversight is the key from a position of understanding the industry, and not reactive regulation and oversight. So in summary, esports' key risk exposures or key exposures include the fact that there's no governing body. There's an agglomeration of different entities that all have different powers and authority, all vying for some sort of control. No understanding of sports betting really amongst the stakeholders. There's no understanding of match fixing, risks of match fixing, detection, how to deal with it. Very limited understanding of mental and physical health. No willingness to really give up the authority. Each entity really wants to hold on to its own decision-making spectrum. They don't want to give any part of that decision-making away. And nobody's really taking responsibility for this issue. You know, it's too hard to do and it's quite a thankless job. So what we see as a result is that it's a very high risk landscape that prejudices youth, the industry in terms of its commercial viability, and of course, fundamentally sporting integrity. So let's have a quick look at ESIC's role in what we're doing to combat and to contribute to the industry reaching its level of maturity. So we are a non-for-profit independent integrity body, and what we aim to do is address those exact things that I identified as risk, which is the youth protection element, the commercial viability element, and that sporting integrity element. And what we do is we work with our industry to establish best practice integrity standards that are enforceable across the industry stakeholders. So we essentially function as a non-for-profit member association body. And I'll illustrate that to you in a second. So our mission statement as ESIC is to be the recognized guardian of integrity in esports and to take responsibility for these risks, essentially serving as that regulatory oversight, but from a self-regulation perspective, allowing the esports industry to come together through the medium of ESIC and self-regulate ahead of being regulated on. And practically the way we do that is we allow members to join and hold themselves accountable voluntarily to be bound by our regulations. And our regulations and our integrity program, which is what I've referred to as regulations, but our integrity program for the sake of semantics, is built around those three issues: the youth protection issue, the investment and commercial security issue, and the competitive integrity and longevity issues. So our integrity program binds our members to act in a way that is consistent, that is standardized, and that transcends jurisdictional or stakeholder differences so that we can achieve integrity outcomes. Give you an example of how it works practically. So let's look at a tournament operator member. ESIC would administer the integrity program. We would investigate, we would sanction any offender that breaches the program. A tournament operator will enter into the membership with ESIC, binding them to our codes, but then they'd pass on that obligation to the end participant through their terms and conditions or whatever user agreements they have that binds them to also adhering to our codes. So we essentially establish a nexus of contracts and jurisdiction where we're able to act as ESIC all the way down through to the end user, sanctioning them and banning them for any contravention of our codes, keeping corrupt actors, keeping risky actors out of the esports industry, and creating that blanket of integrity. Thankfully, the industry has seen a lot of sense in this approach. ESIC's grown significantly, especially over the course of the pandemic, and we've amassed probably what I would consider to be critical mass in the industry, allowing us to be probably one of the most effective mechanisms currently of managing these risks that I've identified. Our stakeholders are incredibly talented, some of the largest companies in esports internationally, and they've expressed a strong support for the notions of managing these risks in the joint benefit, in the joint interest of the industry. We've also cooperated significantly with government, and our government approach is very complementarian. We've supported several governments in understanding esports so as to prevent them from having to regulate reactively and to regulate from a position of maybe less information than they should have, or a position of public pressure. So what we've done is we've essentially gone out and engaged with governments on behalf of our members, and not necessarily from a lobbying perspective, but from a complementarian perspective, to allow them to understand that we exist, that we have the ability to assist them in understanding esports as a phenomenon, and also to help them introduce regulations that are proportionate. We've done this in several jurisdictions, some of which are listed here, but to be frank, there are many more that aren't. And we're doing that on an ongoing basis, dealing with governments on an ongoing basis that approach us proactively, seeking advice and guidance. So summarizing ESIC's role in integrity, we implement the leading regulations, we monitor betting activity, and we prevent fraud. We educate players and industry participants about risk and help them to understand the integrity framework. We investigate and prosecute breaches of the codes, give members an opportunity to be heard by dealing with relevant stakeholders, whether it be governments or publishers. We work with governments on policy and strategy, promote best practice standards on several stakeholder levels, and finally, we prevent cheating and malpractice within the industry. So I know that I have been going for 19 minutes, so I'm about to finish. I think the slot was about 15 minutes long. So in the interest of time, to show you some of our achievements. So in cheating, we did probably one of the largest investigations that we've run. About 15.2 terabytes of video data were interrogated and looked at for an exploitation of a particular bug in the game CSGO. We issued sanctions against 37 offending parties, and the bans were effective across our entire membership, so that no one person can go from one tournament operator essentially that banned them and then just go play in another tournament. Our bans are transcendent across our entire membership, and that's part of the effectiveness of ESIC. In betting, probably one of our most highly publicized and high profile investigations is our joint operation with the FBI and a few other stakeholders in the North American arena for match fixing. So far, we've handed down 3 sanctions in the form of bans as we continue to cooperate with law enforcement on what could potentially be criminal activity. And we still have 34 other unique investigations in this matter that are still ongoing and are to be released shortly. ESIC's also been administering a lot of doping tests. At every LAN event for most of our major members, we actually administer doping tests to test for any substance abuse that would contravene our anti-doping code. So we administer that anti-doping code for all of our members. So far, thankfully, all of our tests have returned no positive results. We have therapeutic use exemption mechanisms to take account for medical use requirements, but the reality is more education is needed, and we need to have a little bit more ability to penetrate the areas that aren't those offline events, you know, where people are all coming together for a major event. We need to be able to also potentially work on doping in the online format where people are qualifying for these massive tournaments from home, because we don't have that insight for that purpose. So that's one area. So the new risks, in summary, in conclusion, that are emerging in the landscape as the international industry continues to grow. Despite the risks that we've already mentioned, we see new risks emerging, and these risks definitely need to be dealt with, at least if not from a proactive perspective, then from a reactive perspective, but preferably from a proactive perspective. And what we've seen from a risk area perspective is that the quality of tournament operations is very sort of inconsistent outside of ESIC membership. So that needs to be addressed as a standard element of industry growth. We need all of the tournament operation. We need all tournament operation, at least in the major sort of tier 1 professional level, to be consistent in the way that they're administered. We need to monitor and deal with the increasing trend for betting fraud. The other areas include player agency. We're actually working on an initiative now to deal with the issue of player agency and the potential for player agents to come into essentially an agency relationship, not knowing what they're up for, and exploit young people who don't understand contracts or understand agency relationships. We're looking at issues of coaching authenticity and credibility. What makes you a credible coach? Are you just a coach because you played the game before? Looking at tournament official knowledge, standardizing the level of minimum requirement for tournament officials that are dealing with, administering these games. Same thing with referee knowledge. And probably one of the most fundamental things is looking at conflicts of interest. For example, a betting operator operating as a tournament operator as well. and seeing the conflicts of interest that arise in those relationships. So, in conclusion, it's very clear, and I hope it's been clear to you as an audience, that while esports is doing a great job with growth, with success, with having the sort of bright lights and camera action sort of perspective from an external view, there is still a lot of work to be done. And this work is suggested by me, at least, and by ESIC, to be extremely fundamental to the success of the industry in the long term. But in those brackets, we say we'll get there. So thank you very much for your time. I hope that's given you a little bit of insight into at least our critical view of where esports is as an industry, and we'll continue to keep anyone updated that's interested on our website, www.esic.gg. But for now, I'll hand over to Hanna.
Thank you so much, Stephan. What an incredible introduction it is to you and your company. We definitely urge our participants, our esteemed delegates, to be in touch with you and understand it further. So thank you once again, Stephan, for being a part of our show today.